So surprise, surprise, another weekend in June, another weekend where we have to sit and talk about the talented visitors Alabama will be playing host to not only this weekend, but have played host to throughout the week. Not only that, but we need to break down the news of Alabama being included in the final two for one of the nation's best players, a five-star offensive tackle who ranks within the top 10 players in all of high school football, Kadyn Proctor, and we need to talk about it all. But before we do, as always, y'all know the drill. I need to hear from you. Hop down to the comments, Y for yes, N for no. And considering Kadyn Proctor included Alabama in his top two, do you believe the Crimson Tide will be successful in landing the five-star offensive tackle? Let me know what you're thinking. If you are new to the channel, be sure to subscribe, hit that bell notification as I do constant college football content. You don't want to miss any of it. And if you enjoyed the content, like and comment down below. But having said that, let's jump right into this. And we're going to start with the Kadyn Proctor news because it's not every day that you're included in the top two of a top 10 prospect, and especially an offensive tackle. And this is going to be an interesting situation because when we break down the top two, we have Iowa and Alabama. If we ask what Iowa provides Kadyn Proctor, the answer is simple. Not only is this an institution that has a history of developing offensive linemen and sending them to the NFL, but it's also proximity to home as he's from the state of Iowa. And maybe that's not something that matters, but it is something worth mentioning and talking about because to some of these prospects, playing close to their family does matter, and if you're Kadyn Proctor and that matters to you, this could be something to watch. However, personally, I don't feel like that's going to be as big of a deal because if it was, the other schools involved would probably be in closer proximity than Alabama. So, this is going to be interesting to watch because Alabama offers supreme development of not only five stars in sending them to the first round, but we also know what Alabama has done with top offensive linemen in recent years. The interesting thing about this is new offensive line coach for the Crimson Tide, Eric Walford, as he finds himself in multiple battles for some of the nation's top offensive linemen. And that right there is what Alabama fans were hoping would happen. It's just going to be interesting to see if now the Crimson Tide can close on some of these battles. But speaking of another offensive lineman in attendance for the Crimson Tide this weekend, we need to talk about five-star offensive tackle Samson Okunlola. And this is another situation I'm going to be watching because Alabama just recently offered, and this is a player that is rose up recruiting boards. If Alabama can shore up any sort of five-star offensive tackle, it's only going to help them, especially with the offensive line woes that were present last year as they look to try and fix that this year. And one way you do that is by stacking depth. And right now, the Alabama Crimson Tide finds themselves in a battle for three five-star offensive tackles, and Francis Mauigoa, Kadyn Proctor, and now Samson Okunlola. So this is something we have to watch going forward because that's exactly where you want the Crimson Tide to be, right in the thick of all of these battles for these top-tier offensive tackles, and I know that's something that's going to excite the Alabama fan base. But who else is visiting this weekend or who has visited? And if we're talking about a player that visited this week, we need to talk about top Juco wide receiver Malik Benson, someone that Alabama has been pushing for. And this is a situation I've been interested in because Alabama was very successful in the transfer portal in identifying wide receivers they liked and wide receivers they felt like could give them help at that position. Whether we're talking about Tyler Harrell or we're talking about Jermaine Burton, those are two names that if you ask around college football fans, those are two names expected to do something this upcoming season. And so will Alabama be able to add in another wide receiver, such as a Juco wide receiver Malik Benson? It's going to be tough to say, but it is the Alabama Crimson Tide, and if anybody could do it, it would certainly be the Tide. But one thing we have to remember is Alabama's coming off of a wide receiver class in the past recruiting cycle that was really intriguing when you break down all the names. I mean, you're talking Kendrick Law, you're talking Aaron Anderson, you're talking Shaz Preston, Kobe Prentice, Isaiah Bond. That's a class I'm really interested in seeing what these guys do once they get on campus. We already saw Aaron Anderson and Kendrick Law make their impact. Those are going to be some dudes. Isaiah Bond and Kobe Prentice have speed you just simply can't teach. And Shaz Preston is such a well-rounded weapon at the wide receiver position. I think he's going to make an impact. But inevitably, you want these talented prospects to be interested, and for Malik Benson to be interested in the Crimson Tide makes complete sense when you see the insane rate of production Alabama has had at that position, which really can't be replicated within college football. A visit that I really have been excited to talk about that's happening this weekend is for a top player in all of high school football, the top cornerback in all of high school football, Cormani McClain, out of the state of Florida. And the interesting thing about this is this was supposed to be an official visit that then got moved to an unofficial visit. And fear not, that I think serves the Crimson Tide well. And let me explain why. Because Alabama was slotted to be McClain's first official visit, and while you feel good that you made the cut to get an official visit, in a perfect world you'd probably rather be closer to the last official visit than the first official visit. You always want to be the last school a prospect goes to because you're fresh on the mind. That can help you in your chances. And so for Alabama, getting this switch to an unofficial visit and getting him back at a later date for an official visit is something that I think will serve the Crimson Tide well, because we talk about new offensive line coach Eric Walford, but new defensive back coach Travaris Robinson is also in the thick of it for multiple top-tier cornerbacks, and none bigger than Cormani McClain, because that would be a huge win for the Crimson Tide. And Robinson is from the state of Florida, so you already know he's going to be hitting that state extra hard, and what better prospect to land out of it than Cormani McClain. But if we're talking defensive back, we have to talk two other names. First and foremost, we need to talk about the five-star safety Caleb Downs, who's visiting Alabama this weekend. And this is one I think Alabama's really going to try and knock out the park, because Caleb Downs would be a great addition in this class. This is something Charles Kelly has been so solid on the trail, and I think that looks to continue with the addition of Caleb Downs if they're able to beat the likes of the Georgia Bulldogs, which, let's be honest, it's never easy recruiting against Kirby Smart and the Dogs. That's another team that develops at a very high rate. They constantly recruit well, so you know you're going to be surrounded by talented pieces. And Georgia can talk about how they just won a national championship, and they've earned that. So it's never easy recruiting against Georgia. It's going to be interesting to see how this battle goes. And there's also another prospect we need to talk about before we end, and that is four-star defensive back Makari Vickers out the state of Florida. And just like I said for Cormani McClain, with Travaris Robinson hailing from the state of Florida, he's going to be hitting that area extra hard. Will he be able to land to Vickers? Tough to say, but it's tough to count out the Crimson Tide for any position, and especially when you really dive deep into the coaches they just got. Because not only are these defensive backs going to be recruited by Charles Kelly, by Travaris Robinson, they're inevitably going to be recruited by Nick Saban, because he's so hands-on with that position, and that's a major impacting factor for a lot of these prospects. And even though I said Makari Vickers was the last prospect we would be talking about, I was wrong, and for that I apologize, because there's one prospect we need to end on, and that's five-star wide receiver Shelton Sampson out the state of Louisiana. And I bring up where he's from for a very important reason. Because right now, Alabama has a quarterback in their class that they love in Eli Holstein, who comes from the state of Louisiana. On top of that, if you look at last year's cycle and previous years, Alabama has had a great time recruiting the state of Louisiana. Will those two things be compelling enough to land Shelton Sampson? It's tough to say, but remember what I talked about from Malik Benson. Whenever you're talking Alabama wide receiver play, you're talking about a rate of development that just simply hasn't been done in college football with the rate of first-round draft picks they've sent out. If John Mechie doesn't get hurt, it is very possible that in 3 years, they have 6 first-round draft picks, a number that quite honestly is astounding. And because of that, you can never count out Alabama for wide receiver talent, and especially when you look, and they're in the running for these top-tier offensive tackles. You can bet your bottom dollar Shelton Sampson sees that. They're in the running for a Richard Young. You bet your bottom dollar he knows that. They already have a very talented quarterback who, if I had to bet, is already in Sampson's ear. All of that is going to be compelling and tough to say no to, but we also need to understand there's a new coach at LSU in Brian Kelly who's been able to recruit as well, who's going to try and establish his own thing, and that deserves our attention. So, some situations we have to watch as recruiting really starts to heat up, and I think that this is going to be a really fun cycle. Hop down to the comments, let me know what you're thinking. That's it. See ya.